The night sky above Cape Canaveral burned an unnatural crimson, a toxic blend of atmospheric fires and the energy signatures of dying starships. Major Jack Harper stood motionless in the Quantum Communication Center, his reflection ghosting against screens filled with cascading data and strategic maps rapidly turning from blue to red. 17 years of constant warfare had etched deep lines into his face, each crease a testament to humanity's longest and most brutal conflict. Outside the reinforced windows, the remnants of Earth's defense fleet scattered like wounded animals, their once proud hulls scared and bleeding electromagnetic radiation. The Varaxian warships hung in orbit like massive predators, their biomechanical structures a nightmare of organic technology and cold calculus. They had systematically dismantled human resistance across the solar system, consuming research stations, lunar colonies, and Martian settlements with ruthless efficiency. Jack's fingers traced the edge of a worn photograph, a moment frozen from before the war. His wife, Maria, smiled back at him, her aerospace engineering uniform crisp and hopeful. She had been among the first casualties, her research station near Jupiter obliterated in the initial invasion. Now she lived only in memory and in the technological legacy she had helped create. The communication center hummed with a desperate energy. Technicians moved with the precise, exhausted choreography of people who knew each movement could be their last. Holographic displays flickered with incoming data streams, each one a potential lifeline or a final death knell for the human race. "Transmission sequence ready, sir," called Lieutenant Rebecca Kim from her station. Her hands danced across quantum encryption panels, preparing what might be humanity's final message to the universe. Unlike traditional military communications, this transmission was something entirely different. A weapon disguised as a communication, a last-ditch effort born from decades of sino-linguistic research and computational strategy. Jack walked to the central platform, his combat boots leaving faint marks on the polished floor. Each step carried the weight of billions, the last remnants of human civilization compressed into this single moment. Scattered refugee colonies on distant moons, underground settlements, and the handful of ships that had managed to escape the solar system all waited with collective breath. "Status report," he commanded, his voice a low growl that cut through the electronic cacophony. Lieutenant Kim's response was clinical, professional. Quantum entanglement matrix at 98% stability. Linguistic encryption protocols are online. We have a 72-hour window before the Varaxian fleet completes its orbital bombardment sequence. The room felt simultaneously massive and claustrophobic. Humanity's entire future condensed into this single communication center, with banks of quantum computers and advanced linguistic algorithms representing their final hope. Years of preparation had led to this moment, a transmission that was part diplomatic communication, part psychological warfare, and part technological virus. Jack remembered the countless strategy meetings, the desperate debates among the world's remaining scientists, linguists, and military strategists. They had analyzed every potential communication vector, every psychological weakness in the Varaxian collective consciousness. This transmission was more than a message. It was a precisely crafted instrument of potential revolution. A warning klaxon briefly screamed through the facility, a reminder of the imminent threat. Varaxian scout ships were beginning their final approach, preparing for the ultimate extinction of human resistance. But Jack knew something the aliens didn't understand. Humanity's greatest strength had always been its capacity for unexpected adaptation. He placed his hand on the quantum transmission interface, feeling the subtle vibrations of technology that represented humanity's most advanced scientific achievement. The device was a culmination of breakthroughs in quantum communication, xenolinguistics, and computational psychology, disciplines that had been refined in the crucible of an impossible war. "Initiate final sequence," Jack commanded. Lieutenant Kim's fingers moved with surgical precision. Quantum encryption layers began to activate, complex algorithmic structures weaving themselves into a transmission that was simultaneously a message, a weapon, and a declaration of defiance. The fate of humanity would be decided in the next few moments, not through conventional warfare, but through a transmission that would challenge everything the Varaxian Confederacy believed about communication, consciousness, and the nature of resistance. Dr. Elena Rodriguez hunched over the quantum encryption console, her fingers moving with the precision of a concert pianist performing a complex symphony. Each keystroke was a carefully calculated note in a digital composition designed to unravel an entire galactic civilization. The small research bunker beneath the Andes Mountains hummed with an intensity that belied the handful of scientists working within its reinforced walls. The transmission they had spent decades preparing was nothing like traditional communication. It was a living, breathing entity, a linguistic virus engineered to exploit the deepest vulnerabilities of the Varaxian neural network. Elena's background in computational linguistics, synapsecology, and advanced cryptography had made her the perfect architect of humanity's most audacious weapon. Linguistic pattern stabilization at 96% called out Dr. Marcus Williams, her longtime collaborator and the lead quantum physicist on the project. His weathered hands danced across holographic displays, manipulating complex algorithmic structures that seemed to shimmer and breathe with an almost organic quality. Elena remembered the early days of the project, when most military strategists had dismissed their approach as scientific fantasy. The idea that a communication could be a weapon seemed absurd to traditional military thinking. But the team had persevered, driven by a fundamental understanding that language itself was the most powerful technology humanity possessed. The Varaxian communication network was a marvel of biotechnological engineering, a massive interconnected system that allowed instantaneous communication across thousands of star systems. It was also their greatest weakness. The aliens had developed a communication model so sophisticated that it had become rigid, predictable, almost algorithmic in its approach to information processing. What the Varaxians didn't understand was the human capacity for linguistic innovation, for creating meaning through context, emotion, and subtle psychological manipulation. Their communication was a perfect, sealed system. Humanity's language was a living, mutating organism. Quantum entanglement stabilizers are holding, Marcus announced, his voice tight with concentration. We're maintaining synchronization across multiple dimensional frequencies. The transmission they were preparing was multilayered beyond anything the Varaxian Confederacy could comprehend. On the surface, it would appear to be a standard diplomatic communication, complete with appropriate syntactical structures and communication protocols. Buried within those layers were complex viral algorithms designed to exploit the tiniest vulnerabilities in the alien communication network. Elena pulled up a holographic representation of the transmission structure. It looked like a complex, three-dimensional mandala, each layer interconnected, each section capable of morphing and adapting based on the response it received. Years of research into alien communication patterns, synapsecology, and quantum information theory had gone into its design. Psychological trigger sequences are primed, she muttered, more to herself than to Marcus. Each sequence was a carefully crafted piece of linguistic dynamite, designed to generate specific emotional and cognitive responses within the Varaxian hierarchy. The bunker's primary power generator began to pulse with increased intensity. Banks of quantum computers worked at the absolute limits of their computational capacity, generating and verifying millions of potential communication scenarios each second. This was more than a message. It was a living weapon of pure information. A sudden alert flashed across the main display. Varaxian communication frequencies were becoming more active, their scout ships increasing communication density as they prepared for the final assault on Earth. Perfect timing. Initiating transmission sequence, Marcus called out, his voice a mixture of scientific excitement and profound tension. Elena's hand hovered over the final activation switch. 17 years of war, decades of research, the collective hopes of humanity's scattered survivors, all compressed into this singular moment. The transmission would travel faster than light, carried by quantum entanglement, its true nature hidden beneath layers of seemingly innocuous communication. "Sending," she said simply. The transmission erupted from their quantum communication array, a burst of pure information that seemed to bend the very fabric of space-time. To the Varaxian sensors, it would appear as a standard communication packet, but buried within its structure were algorithms designed to do far more than communicate. They were engineered to destabilize, to question, to create doubt. Humanity's final weapon was not a missile or a battleship. It was a message, a perfectly crafted piece of linguistic technology that would challenge everything the Varaxian Confederacy believed about communication, consciousness, and the nature of intelligent resistance. Deep within the Varaxian central communication nexus, the first signs of infection began to manifest. What appeared to be a routine diplomatic transmission from a distant outpost slowly revealed its true nature, a meticulously engineered digital pathogen that moved through the alien network like a phantom. Overseer Krullink's watched with growing unease as communication patterns began to shift in ways that defied their sophisticated predictive algorithms. The holographic displays that typically showed a perfect, synchronized flow of information now flickered with anomalies, micro-discontinuities that seemed to pulse with an almost organic rhythm. Diagnostic protocol, Krullink's commanded, his multi-jointed appendages moving across the neural interface, but each attempt to isolate the anomaly only seemed to spread its influence further. The transmission was alive, adaptive, learning and mutating faster than any technological defense could comprehend. In the transmission's core were layers of linguistic algorithms that did more than communicate. They questioned, they destabilized, they introduced fundamental uncertainties into the Varaxian collective consciousness. Humanity had weaponized communication itself, turning language into a form of digital guerrilla warfare that attacked the very foundations of alien cognitive processing. The first major breach occurred in the communication relay near the Gamma Quadrant outpost. What should have been a standard data transfer began to unravel the intricate neural connections that formed the backbone of Varaxian interstellar communication. Relay stations started to produce contradictory information, their perfectly synchronized networks developing microscopic fractures that spread like a digital infection. Dr. Elena Rodriguez would have smiled if she could see the elegant destruction unfolding. Each line of code was a carefully placed explosive, designed to create maximum disruption with minimum direct intervention. The transmission worked by introducing subtle uncertainties, by creating cognitive dissonance that would slowly tear apart the alien civilization's communication infrastructure. Krullink's watched in horror as communication protocols began to fail. The Varaxian network had always been their greatest strength, an instantaneous, perfectly synchronized system that allowed near-instantaneous communication across thousands of star systems. Now that very strength became their most significant vulnerability. "Initiate complete network isolation," Krullink's commanded, but the words came too late. The transmission had already penetrated too deeply, its algorithms spreading like a sophisticated neural virus. Each attempt to contain the infection only seemed to accelerate its spread, the human-designed communication weapon showing an adaptability that defied conventional understanding. In the research bunker beneath the ends, Marcus Williams tracked the transmission's progress through a complex holographic display. "Cognitive destabilization at 47%, he muttered to Elena. "The linguistic algorithms are performing beyond our most optimistic projections." The transmission worked on multiple levels simultaneously. At its most basic, it appeared to be a standard diplomatic communication. Buried within that veneer were complex algorithmic sequences that attacked the Varaxian communication network's fundamental operating principles. It introduced microscopic uncertainties, created subtle cognitive conflicts, and exploited the rigid structure of alien communication protocols. Varaxian communication had always been a perfectly synchronized system, each information packet moving with machine-like precision. Humanity's weapon introduced something the aliens had never encountered: true unpredictability. Each line of code was a question, each algorithm a challenge to the very nature of their collective consciousness. Communication relays across the Varaxian network began to produce increasingly erratic outputs. Fleet coordination systems started to generate conflicting strategic assessments. Intelligence networks found themselves unable to trust their most basic information-gathering mechanisms. The transmission is adaptive, one Voraxian technician reported, her voice tinged with a growing sense of panic. It's learning, changing, evolving with each communication cycle. What made the human weapon truly terrifying was its ability to exploit the Voraxian network's greatest strength, its perfect synchronization. By introducing microscopic uncertainties, the transmission created cascading failures that spread exponentially. Each attempt to isolate the infection only seemed to accelerate its spread. Krellings realized with growing horror that they were facing something beyond a traditional attack. This was warfare at the level of consciousness itself, an attack that struck at the very foundations of their collective communication and cognitive processing. The transmission continued its relentless spread, a digital wildfire that consumed the carefully constructed communication networks of an entire galactic civilization. Humanity had transformed communication into a weapon, turning language itself into the most dangerous technology in the universe. The psychological impact of the transmission began to ripple through the Voraxian Confederacy like a silent earthquake. Dr. Claire Nakamura watched the preliminary analysis with a mixture of scientific fascination and profound respect for the team that had engineered this unprecedented weapon of cognitive warfare. In the deep research bunker located beneath the Chilean mountain range, holographic displays captured the intricate psychological breakdown occurring across Voraxian communication networks. Each display represented a different layer of psychological manipulation, a testament to humanity's most advanced understanding of collective consciousness and interspecies communication. Cognitive dissonance is spreading exponentially, Marcus Williams announced, his fingers dancing across the quantum analysis interface. The transmission is targeting fundamental belief structures with surgical precision. The human team had spent decades studying Voraxian psychology, mapping the intricate neural pathways that define their collective decision-making processes. Their weapon was far more than a simple communication. It was a precisely crafted psychological instrument designed to unravel an entire civilization's sense of self. At the core of the transmission were layers of carefully constructed linguistic triggers. These weren't just words or messages, but sophisticated psychological algorithms that attacked the very foundations of Voraxian collective identity. Each communication packet introduced subtle questions, microscopic doubts that would grow and multiply like a cognitive virus. Within the Voraxian leadership chambers, the first signs of psychological breakdown became apparent. Overseer Krellings found himself questioning fundamental beliefs that had governed their civilization for millennia. The transmission worked by introducing nuanced emotional and cognitive challenges that the rigid Voraxian communication system had no mechanism to process. "We are experiencing unprecedented cognitive disruption," reported Sub-Commander Zarek, his communication tentacles writhing with visible distress. The communication patterns are introducing fundamental uncertainties about our collective purpose. The psychological warfare had multiple sophisticated layers. One level introduced doubt about the Voraxian Confederacy's military objectives. Another layer challenged their understanding of cultural identity. Yet another subtly highlighted the cost of their expansionist policies, introducing empathy and self-reflection where none had existed before. Dr. Nakamura pulled up a complex visualization of the psychological infection. It looked like a living, breathing entity, a network of cognitive tendrils that spread through the alien communication systems, introducing microscopic challenges to their most fundamental beliefs. "We're seeing a complete breakdown of collective decision-making processes," she muttered, tracing the complex patterns of psychological destabilization. The transmission had identified and exploited the most subtle psychological vulnerabilities in the Voraxian social structure. Within Voraxian military command centers, long-standing hierarchical structures began to crumble. Officers started to question orders that had previously been accepted without thought. The transmission introduced a level of individual critical thinking that was entirely foreign to their collective consciousness. Marcus Williams watched the progression with scientific excitement. "It's like watching a civilization learn to think for the first time," he said, his voice a mixture of awe and professional detachment. The transmission was doing more than attacking. It was teaching, introducing concepts of individual agency and critical thought. The psychological impact went far beyond simple communication disruption. The transmission challenged fundamental assumptions about consciousness, about collective identity, about the nature of civilization itself. It introduced nuanced emotional complexity into a society that had previously operated with machine-like precision. Emotional response algorithms are activating, one of the research team called out. The holographic displays showed complex emotional landscapes beginning to emerge within the Varaxian communication networks: fear, doubt, curiosity, empathy. Emotions that had previously been suppressed were now flooding their collective consciousness. Sub-Commander Zarek found himself experiencing something entirely new: individual doubt. The transmission had introduced a fundamental challenge to the Varaxian understanding of self. Where once there had been absolute certainty, now there were questions. Where there had been unquestioning obedience, now there was critical reflection. The psychological weapon worked by introducing the most dangerous thing possible into a rigidly controlled collective consciousness: the concept of individual choice. As the transmission continued its relentless psychological assault, the Varaxian Confederacy began to fragment. Not through external force, but through the most powerful weapon humanity had ever created: the ability to make a civilization question itself. On the mining colony of Kepler 742 bits, the first signs of rebellion began with a whisper. A communications technician named Zelra stood frozen, her translation modules struggling to process the incoming transmission that had somehow slipped through the Varaxian communication blockades. The message was unlike anything in the recorded history of the subjugated species. It spoke of choice, of individual agency, of the possibility of resistance. Hidden within layers of complex linguistic algorithms were messages that targeted the deepest psychological wounds of every oppressed civilization in the Varaxian Confederacy. Dr. Elena Rodriguez had designed the transmission as a multi-dimensional weapon. It was not just a communication. It was a key designed to unlock the collective trauma of dozens of conquered civilizations. Each carefully crafted phrase introduced concepts of resistance that had been systematically suppressed for generations. On the research platform deep beneath the Andes Mountains, Marcus Williams tracked the transmission spread across multiple star systems. "We're seeing exponential activation of dormant resistance protocols," he called out, his voice a mixture of scientific excitement and human hope. The Kepler 742 bits mining colony had been under Varaxian control for 247 standard cycles. Generations of miners had lived and died under a system of absolute control, their entire existence reduced to resource extraction. The transmission introduced something revolutionary: the concept that their current state was not inevitable. Zelbra's translation modules began to break down as the message continued. It wasn't just information, it was a form of psychological liberation. The transmission spoke directly to the collective trauma of subjugated species, introducing concepts of resistance that had been systematically eliminated from their cultural memory. Resistance is not destruction. The message read in perfect translation. Resistance is reclaiming your right to choose. Across the Kepler mining complex, workers began to look at each other differently. Communication systems that had been tightly controlled suddenly became conduits of shared understanding. The transmission worked by creating microscopic connections, by helping isolated individuals recognize their shared experiences. Dr. Claire Nakamura watched the progression with scientific fascination. The transmission was doing more than spreading information. It was creating a collective consciousness of resistance. Each communication packet was designed to activate dormant psychological triggers, to help subjugated species recognize their own potential for agency. On a dozen different worlds, similar scenes played out. Communication systems that had been tools of control became networks of potential rebellion. The Varaxian method of maintaining order, total information control, was being turned against itself. The mining colony's central control system began to experience cascading communication failures. What had once been a perfectly synchronized network of control now became a fractured system of individual communication. Workers who had never spoken to each other began to share experiences, to recognize their shared oppression. Rebellion activation at 37%. Marcus called out, tracking the transmission spread across multiple star systems. The numbers didn't just represent statistical data, they represented hope, the potential for fundamental change. Zelra found herself experiencing something entirely new, individual thought. The transmission had introduced a fundamental challenge to the understanding of self that had been imposed by generations of Voraxian control. Where once there had been absolute compliance, now there were questions. Where there had been unquestioning obedience, now there was the possibility of choice. On the research platform, Elena Rodriguez watched the holographic displays with a sense of profound possibility. This was more than a military strategy. It was a fundamental reimagining of how civilizations could communicate, could resist, could transform themselves. The transmission worked by creating connections. It spoke to the collective trauma of subjugated species, but it also highlighted their potential for resilience, for individual and collective transformation. Each communication packet was a carefully designed bridge between isolation and collective action. Across multiple star systems, the first sparks of rebellion began to catch fire. The Voraxian Confederacy had always believed that control was absolute, that resistance was impossible. They had never understood the most fundamental human truth, that hope is the most contagious force in the universe. As communication systems continued to break down, as subjugated species began to recognize their shared potential, the Voraxian Confederacy found itself facing something it had never anticipated, a rebellion that was being fought not with weapons, but with words, with understanding, with the profound human capacity for hope. The Voraxian Central Command Complex trembled, not from external attack, but from the internal destruction spreading through its most critical systems. Overseer Krellinx watched in mounting horror as communication networks began to disintegrate, each attempt to reassert control only accelerating the catastrophic breakdown. What had begun as a seemingly innocuous transmission had become a full-scale systemic collapse. Communication relays that once operated with perfect synchronization now produced a cacophony of contradictory information. Strategic networks fractured, military coordination dissolved, and the once impenetrable unified consciousness of the Voraxian Confederacy began to splinter. Communication integrity at 23%, reported Sub-Commander Zarek, his voice trembling with an emotion that was entirely new to their species. Fear. The transmission had introduced something fundamentally destructive to their collective system: individual uncertainty. Dr. Elena Rodriguez tracked the collapse from the research bunker beneath the ends, her fingers moving across quantum interface displays that captured the intricate breakdown of an entire galactic civilization. Each algorithmic sequence was performing beyond their most optimistic projections, creating a cascade of systemic failures that attacked the very foundations of Voraxian social structure. The collapse was multidimensional. Communication systems failed, but with them went the elaborate social hierarchies, the carefully maintained control mechanisms, the unified consciousness that had defined Voraxian civilization for millennia. What humans understood, and the Voraxians did not, was the fundamental fragility of systems that allowed no room for individual thought. Marcus Williams watched the holographic displays with a mixture of scientific fascination and profound respect. "We're seeing a complete breakdown of collective decision-making processes," he muttered. The transmission had introduced a virus far more sophisticated than any technological attack, a virus of consciousness itself. In military command centers across the Voraxian fleet, long-standing communication protocols began to produce increasingly erratic results. Warship squadrons received conflicting orders. Strategic assessment algorithms generated multiple contradictory potential outcomes. The perfect machine of Voraxian military might was tearing itself apart from within. "Initiate complete network isolation," Krellinx commanded, but the words came out as a desperate plea rather than a confident order. Each attempt to contain the transmission only seemed to accelerate its spread, the human-designed communication weapon showing an adaptability that defied their understanding of information systems. The transmission worked on multiple levels simultaneously. It attacked communication infrastructure, yes, but it did something far more profound. It introduced the concept of individual choice into a system that had never conceived of such a possibility. Varaxian society had been built on the premise of absolute collective unity. Now that unity was revealing itself to be a fragile illusion. Across multiple star systems, Varaxian control systems began to fail. Research stations went dark. Communication relays produced nonsensical outputs. Military coordination networks generated increasingly bizarre and contradictory strategic assessments. The transmission is learning, one technician reported, her voice rising with a mixture of terror and fascination. It's adapting faster than our defensive algorithms can process. Dr. Claire Nakamura tracked the psychological breakdown with scientific precision. The transmission wasn't just destroying communication systems. It was dismantling the very concept of collective consciousness that had defined Varaxian civilization. Each communication packet introduced microscopic challenges to their most fundamental beliefs, creating cognitive fractures that spread exponentially. Sub-Commander Zarek experienced something unprecedented, individual doubt. The transmission had introduced a fundamental challenge to the Varaxian understanding of self, where once there had been absolute certainty. Now there were questions. Where there had been unquestioning obedience, now there was critical reflection. The Varaxian leadership found themselves experiencing something entirely new, individual fear. The unified consciousness that had been their greatest strength now became their most significant vulnerability. Each attempt to reassert control only seemed to highlight their fundamental weakness. As communication systems continued to collapse, the Varaxian Confederacy discovered the most terrifying truth, that their perfect, synchronized civilization was built on a foundation of absolute control that could not withstand the slightest introduction of individual agency. The transmission continued its relentless destruction, a digital wildfire that consumed the carefully constructed communication networks of an entire galactic civilization. Humanity had transformed communication into a weapon more powerful than any physical force, a weapon that attacked the very nature of consciousness itself. Major Jack Harper stood in the hidden launch complex deep beneath the Rocky Mountains, surrounded by holographic displays that painted a real-time picture of galactic chaos. What had begun as a seemingly impossible transmission was now unfolding into humanity's most audacious military strategy in history. The quantum communication weapon had been merely the first phase. Now, hidden networks of resistance cells, advanced weaponry, and strategic assets began to activate across multiple star systems. These were not conventional military units, but a distributed network of human resistance that had been preparing for this moment for decades. Quantum relay networks are online, Lieutenant Rebecca Kim reported, her fingers dancing across advanced communication interfaces. We're seeing unprecedented levels of system activation. What the Varaxian Confederacy didn't understand was the true extent of human preparation. Scattered refugee colonies, underground research stations, and deep space habitats had been more than simple survival outposts. They were carefully positioned nodes in a massive, distributed resistance network. Dr. Elena Rodriguez watched the strategic displays with a mixture of scientific precision and military determination. The transmission had created precisely the conditions they had predicted: a complete breakdown of Varaxian communication and military coordination. Now, humanity would exploit every microscopic weakness. Advanced weapon systems that had been hidden for years began to come online. Stealth colonies near the galactic rim activated quantum communication arrays. Research stations that had appeared to be simple scientific outposts revealed themselves as sophisticated military staging grounds. First wave of strategic insertions beginning, Marcus Williams called out, tracking the complex network of resistance movements. The human strategy was brilliantly simple: use the chaos created by the transmission to strike at the most vulnerable points of the Varaxian military infrastructure. On the mining colony of Kepler 742 bits, workers who had moments ago been slaves now became a coordinated resistance force. Mining equipment was rapidly converted to weapons. Communication systems that had been tools of oppression now became networks of rebellion. Jack watched as holographic displays showed multiple simultaneous strikes across Voraxian-controlled territories. Each attack was precisely coordinated, exploiting the communication breakdown with surgical precision. Humanity was fighting a war of unprecedented complexity, a conflict that was simultaneously technological, psychological, and strategic. Voraxian defensive networks are showing 89% computational disruption, Lieutenant Kim reported. The transmission had done more than create chaos. It had fundamentally altered the computational abilities of the alien civilization. Research stations that had been preparing for this moment for decades now revealed their true purpose. Advanced weapon systems came online, not massive battleships, but distributed networks of precision strike capabilities. Quantum communication arrays activated communication networks that the Voraxian Confederacy had no ability to track or understand. Dr. Claire Nakamura monitored the psychological impact of the counteroffensive. The transmission had done more than create military opportunities. It had fundamentally transformed the consciousness of subjugated species. Entire populations that had been under Voraxian control for generations were now actively resisting. Strategic insertion points are showing 97% effectiveness, Marcus called out. The human strategy was unlike any military operation in recorded history. This was not a conventional war of territory or resources. This was a war of consciousness, of communication, of fundamental possibility. Voraxian fleet formations began to disintegrate. Communication networks that had once allowed perfect coordination now produced only confusion and contradiction. Military units found themselves unable to communicate, unable to coordinate, unable to understand the nature of the attack being launched against them. Jack understood the true nature of their strategy. This was not about destroying the Voraxian Confederacy through brute force. This was about introducing the possibility of choice, of resistance, of individual agency. All units, execute Phase 2, Jack commanded. The counteroffensive spread like a quantum wave across multiple star systems. Resistance cells that had been preparing for generations now moved with coordinated precision. Mining colonies became fortresses. Research stations became command centers. Every human outpost, every refugee settlement, became a potential point of strategic insertion. The Voraxian Confederacy was discovering the most terrifying truth about humanity, that their greatest weapon was not technological superiority, but the ability to transform possibility into reality. As the counteroffensive continued, it became clear that this was more than a military campaign. This was a fundamental reimagining of galactic power structures, a declaration that humanity would no longer accept the role of a conquered species. The final dissolution of the Voraxian Confederacy happened not with a thunderous battle, but with a profound silence. Major Jack Harper watched from the Quantum Communications Center as entire star systems began to recalibrate their understanding of existence. Dr. Elena Rodriguez stood beside him, her hand still hovering over the quantum interface that had begun this unprecedented transformation. The transmission that had started as a desperate last hope had become something far more significant, a fundamental reimagining of galactic civilization. Confederacy communication networks are completely offline, Lieutenant Rebecca Kim reported, her voice a mixture of professional detachment and barely contained emotion. We're seeing complete systemic collapse across all previously controlled territories. What humanity had accomplished was more than a military victory. They had introduced a revolutionary concept to a galactic civilization that had never understood individual agency. The Voraxian system of absolute control had been built on the assumption that collective consciousness meant uniformity. Humanity had proven that true collective potential came from individual choice. Marcus Williams tracked the aftermath on holographic displays that showed the incredible complexity of the transformation. Subjugated species were not just rebelling. They were reimagining their entire social and political structures. The transmission had done more than create chaos. It had provided a blueprint for collective liberation. On hundreds of worlds, former Varaxian colonies began to communicate in ways they never had before. Communication systems that had once been tools of control became networks of shared understanding, of collective possibility. The rigid hierarchies that had defined galactic civilization for millennia began to dissolve. Psychological reconstruction protocols are showing unprecedented stability, Dr. Claire Nakamura observed, analyzing the complex data streams. The transmission had been more than a weapon. It was a form of collective therapy for entire civilizations that had been stripped of their individual identities. Jack understood the true significance of what they had accomplished. This was not about defeating an enemy, but about introducing a fundamental concept of freedom that transcended traditional understanding of conflict. The Quantum Communication Center hummed with a sense of profound possibility. The holographic displays showed the gradual reconstruction of communication networks, but these were fundamentally different from what had existed before. Each network now contained the potential for individual choice, for diverse perspectives, for genuine collective understanding. We're seeing the emergence of entirely new communication paradigms, Marcus called out, his voice filled with scientific excitement. The transmission had done more than destroy the Varaxian system. It had provided a template for a new form of galactic civilization. On the mining colony of Kepler 742 bits, former slaves were now building their first truly democratic communication networks. Research stations that had been sites of oppression were becoming centers of collaborative exploration. Every world touched by the transmission was experiencing a fundamental transformation. Elena Rodriguez pulled up a complex visualization of the communication networks. What had once been a rigid, hierarchical system now looked like a living, breathing ecosystem of communication. Each node had the potential for individual expression, for unique contribution. Complete systemic transformation at 94%, Lieutenant Kim reported. The Varaxian Confederacy had believed that control was the ultimate form of civilization. Humanity had proven that true strength came from the ability to choose, to communicate, to understand. The transmission had been a weapon of unprecedented sophistication, a tool that attacked not with physical force, but with the most powerful concept in existence, possibility. Jack thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. 17 years of constant warfare, countless sacrifices, the near extinction of humanity. And now this, a transformation that would reshape galactic civilization. Final analysis complete, Marcus announced. The holographic displays showed something unprecedented. A galactic landscape of potential, of newfound freedom. The rigid structures that had defined interstellar civilization for millennia had been completely dismantled. In the research bunker beneath the Endes, humanity watched as they transformed from a nearly extinct species to the architects of a new galactic paradigm. The transmission had been more than a weapon. It had been a declaration of the most fundamental human truth, that freedom is not given, it is claimed. As the final communication network stabilized, a message began to propagate across multiple star systems. It was simple, profound, transformative. You are not alone. You have a choice.